Representative Bacala. Only if you promise to be shorter than Representative Ivey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Yes, I will do my best to abbreviate my comments. Last year, you may recall that we had two bills that made it through the House of Representatives. The first one was HB 2 in the first special session, the first extraordinary. The second one was HB 480, which was in the regular session. Both of those bills passed the House of Representatives. In the special, it just died on the vine with no action, and in the regular HB 480 didn't survive Senate Committee on Revenue and Fiscal Affairs. We told you last year that we went into this, it was a Medicaid bill where we wanted the legislative auditor to be able to look at Medicaid records or the tax records for Medicaid recipients, because we had a great suspicion that maybe there were a lot of people signed up who were ineligible. At that point in time, it was purely speculation based on some information that we received from the Department of Revenue that was rather disturbing. The revenue data actually said that it looked like 25% of the population in Medicaid misreported their income levels by $20,000 or more, and that 48% of those people enrolled in Medicaid had a different number of dependents on an income tax return and a Medicaid. Again, last year was all speculation. This year, most of what we thought was a problem has proved to be true in the limited amount of time that we've looked at these things. Quickly speaking, we had an $85 million audit finding in the Department of Health's Medicaid program. I think that was in November. That was followed up in December with $111 million finding in the Medicaid program. The legislative auditor identified 19,000 people who appeared to be ineligible and turned those names over to the Department of Health. The Department of Health, and I'm not sure how much the overlap is, recently found 30,000 people who were ineligible in the program. And that's only, those two numbers, at 19 and 30,000 people, came from a survey of less than 1/3 of the total Medicaid population. Both of them returned about an 8% error rate. This past week, information was received from we enticed them to tell us. The Department of Revenue turned over 1,600 names to the Department of Health of people enrolled in Medicaid who earned more than $100,000 last year. I forgot the staggering number, maybe somebody else will refresh my memory, of the number of people who made $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, and $90,000 a year and enrolled in Medicaid. In short, last year we came to you with suspicions. This year we come to you with evidence. Evidence produced by the legislative auditor, evidence produced by the Department of Revenue, who, by the way, will not share that information with the Medicaid Task Force or with Ways or Appropriations Committee. They chose not to, despite the fact that an Attorney General's opinion recently filed said it was okay to do so. Right now, if you applied that 8% error rate that we're finding to the entire population, which it hadn't been done yet, the number would work out to about 128,000 people improperly enrolled. The cost, $750 million of improper enrollment, if that proves to be true across the population. I think this is one of the most serious problems we have. How can we look the voter in the eye and act like we're doing our job if we have such fraud, waste, or abuse, or call it whatever you want, in the largest state program in the state, the largest program in the state? I remind you that about 1/3 of the state dollars in the state of Louisiana goes toward the program. 1/3, self-generated, all forms. And then about 1/2 of the budget, when you include federal revenue, half the budget is this program. $13 billion proposed this year. This is serious business, and I think we ought to clean up or give our auditor the authority to go in and do one thing. Right now, the legislative auditor can look at any income tax record out there. He has the authority now to look at it. What he can't do is use that information to audit the Medicaid program. I'll tell you something else that's peculiar. Medicaid eligibility is based on roughly 2 or 3 things. Income level for a household size, and the income level. Household size is determined by a whole bunch of different factors. Marital status, tax filer status, go into the code, it's all kind of different things. I got an email recently from the Department of Revenue. Department of Health. Marital status, you know how we verify that? We don't. Self-attestation. Tax filer status, self-attestation. Tax dependent, self-attestation. Household composition, self-attestation. In other words, we just take people's word for it. If you say, I got a family of 4, okay. I got a family of 8, okay. I'm married, okay. I'm not married, okay. And I have cases specifically where somebody was on Medicaid for 5 years and kicked off when the state found out the person was married, because they had to include the husband's income then. So we just have a number of problems. Now this year, I brought this bill to you and I broadened it out because, quite frankly, right now we have a set of programs in place, Medicaid being the one that the goal here to audit. Tomorrow, what are we going to have? Next year, 5 years from now, we're going to have more programs that look different but similar, that are based on income levels and people able to get benefits based on their income. I try to look forward and say, you know what? What if we enact another program next year? What if Medicaid goes away and we just call it something else next year? Then we're going to have to go through this whole process again. So I made it broad, and suddenly, quite frankly, today I started getting real concerns about, but what about quality jobs? What about LED programs? What about this? What about that? I'll remind you, look at the 4 corners of the bill. The 4 corners of the bill are pretty simple. If you receive state dollars because based on an income level or asset level, then the auditor can look at it. He can't kick anybody off of any program. All he can do is look at it and report findings. That's all. Now, I think between now and the floor, I think a lot of the concerns could be alleviated simply by talking, which we haven't had a great opportunity to, because I think this bill kind of sneaked up on some people. But we can figure this out just talking. But regardless, I think this bill needs to move forward in its present form, in an amended form, in something. And I tell you, honestly, I think people who I've talked to, if we don't vote for this bill, I think they lose a lot of confidence in us being a representative of the people. So, Mr. Chairman, that's about as brief as I can get it. I will open for questions.
Okay. Mr. Prepare, before we go to questions, do you have anything that you want to say at this point, or you just? I have a card from you that you're here from information.
For information only, yes, sir.
Okay. Representative James for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Bacala, thank you for bringing the bill. It really didn't sneak up on me. I knew you were coming with it. I don't know who hadn't been paying attention. You mentioned a couple things that we found out. You failed to mention that the Department of Health, a lot of the 30,000, they were able to determine that because of the new system that we all knew that they had been working on. So that system has proven to be effective, correct?
Correct. And I think, again, I just go back. I think I did attribute that 30,000 to them. I didn't attribute it to their system. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because for those listening, it almost sounded like the legislative auditor made a complaint, and then all of a sudden those numbers magically appear, when in actuality the department has been working with an archaic system that they knew was flawed, that we've all known that they've been working on. The system is now in place. This audit report came out a couple of days before the system launched, but what we now know, since we're talking about the facts, the system that they put in place worked, right?
It appears to the degree that they're using it. Again, they've only used it to match up about 1/3 of the population, and we're still waiting for the rest. I think something else they testified to last week is 2/3 of the population they're just letting roll through on their annual renewal. And I think the testimony was about 1/3 of the people were denied renewal because of ineligibility.
So, but it's working.
I think so, yeah. I think we're getting there.
The other, you mentioned, I think, another 1,600. How did we find those folks?
Last year, the task force on Medicaid fraud asked for and received a report from the Department of Health that kind of gave ranges of how far out of a compliance it appeared people were. It was very loose. They repeated a very similar program this year. Instead of sharing with the task force, they shared with the Department of Health. And that was basically, we've been trying to get that done for a while, and it happened, and that's where they identified. I think the number is 1,661 people who making over. It's 1,600 something. I think the number was 1,672. My auditor's telling me we had 1,672 people on the Medicaid rolls making more than 100,000. I will add that, you think about this, we're not trying to kick people off. We try to direct the dollars where they're needed.
No, I get that.
And the ACA allows, even if somebody is removed from the rolls, they can go on the ACA website and perhaps get big subsidies.
Yeah, I get that. I know your goal is to make sure that the dollars are well spent, and no matter where we fall on the issue, I think we all have issues with fraud. We all have issues with when government resources are going to folks that don't need it, and more resources could be going to those families that do. My second, I think, so we have another 30,000 plus that was identified because of the new system. We have another 1,672. So there are things that are working to eliminate some of the issues you have without us going into 47-1508 and delving into confidential tax rates.
I think we're getting better, even if this doesn't happen. But I think we add to I think we ensure and we give some confidence. I mean, basically, we tell the auditor you're responsible for auditing the programs of the state, but we're not going to give you the authority to audit the program that accounts for half the whole state budget. So I think we have to make sure that we're giving the auditor the authority to fulfill his responsibilities as well.
It sounds like he already has them with the detailed report that he issued that you talked about. He identified certain things. We already have some self-correcting measures.
Well, his limitation was he looked at Workforce Data Commission, so all he could look at was salary reported to Workforce Commission. That didn't include retirement income, investment income, military income, self-employment income, marital status, household size, et cetera, et cetera. So even with the severe limitation of being able to not look at those things, he was able, just looking at individuals who are single, no dependents, who signed up during the expansion. That narrow population, he found 19,000 without even having access to the other data points.
Does he also have the restraints when other areas of fraud, like workers' comp, folks that are misclassifying workers? Because I don't see us asking for additional tax records for him to be able to look at fraud in that regard. Are you concerned in fraud there? And potentially opening up this bill to look at fraud on all across Louisiana.
The bill
hold on,
written.
I'm not finished. Let me finish.
Okay.
Because we have fraud and misrepresentation. You mentioned a lot of things. Would you be, Mr. Legislative Auditor, you can answer since you're sitting there. Do you feel like you have the adequate powers now to be able to attack issues like misrepresentation, misclassification of workers with the information that you have now?
Representative James, I do have a project going on right now that we are looking at misclassified employees, but I cannot use tax data right now to do that.
Would you like to be able to use tax data? That will help you, just like we're trying to help you with Medicaid. Let's help you attack fraud on every corner, not just the Medicaid recipients. Would you be amenable to that?
I think the answer to that is, of course, any help that I can get to added tools to be able to do the job, absolutely.
I want to make your job easier for you, not just in Medicaid, because I know that I was at a conference 3 weeks ago, and I know misclassification of workers is a big thing here. Mr. Bacala, you talked about some of the concerns. So folks were concerned that your bill may address some of the issues that the legislative auditor just told us he needed help with. Mm-hmm. Would you be open to amending your bill so we could give him that authority?
If you don't amend it, he gets the authority. If you read my bill, that's the authority he's given.
So under your bill, he could look at tax information for all those folks that qualify for ITEP and quality jobs and on page 35 of this nice tax exempt budget, what some of my constituents would like to know.
If you'll, I'll draw your attention to the bill. It says that it's for verifying compliance. Well, let's see. I'm sorry. We can use it for any program where that you can look at income tax records for any program that exists that's based partially or wholly upon income or an asset test. So if there's an income or asset test in a state program where state or federal dollars, we're either spending dollars or administering dollars, the auditor has the authority under this bill to look at income tax records for verification.
But what about those tax incentive programs that income isn't a criteria, like
I
ITEP?
think some of those would be outside the four corners of the bill. I'm not.
That's why I'm
saying
asking if you support an amendment, because you talked about fraud, and he just stated that he would be able to.
Ted, you know, I'll not support an amendment till I see an amendment. So I don't know where I'll be on it. But I also think a lot of that your concerns are probably addressed in the bill in its current form. But I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. I'd like to see the bill first. I'd like to look at the programs. It's a little bit complicated just to do it on the fly for me on this one.
We've been doing them on the fly all day. Representative Bacala. And I would like for you to refer to me as Representative James while we're having this discussion. We've tried to amend this a couple times. We've had the same issue pop up because we want to be about fraud and waste, but only for specific programs. So I've been working with staff because I don't believe that this bill will cover all of those programs. So since we have an instrument and the legislative auditor said that those tools will help him, I would like to amend this to include all of our tax incentive programs, just to provide that language. So I'm comfortable, since you mentioned that the bill probably does that. Let's make me a little bit more comfortable and strengthen the language to make sure that the legislative auditor can look at confidential tax records for all of the companies that benefit from our very lucrative tax incentive programs. I've talked to Ms. Pryor. I don't know if in concept that's what I want to do. I want to offer that amendment.
Okay. All right. We'll come back to an amendment. Representative James, let's finish the questions, and then I don't know if you want to get with staff and try to write something up between now and then so we have a little more clarity as to what the language would be. Let me go on to the next questioner, Representative Horton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative Bacala, for bringing this bill. I was told when you brought this last year, I was doing research, and 36 other states already do this. No one, as Representative James says, wants to support fraud, waste, and abuse, and by objecting to this bill, that's what you do. I mean, we want people who need and deserve and qualify for these benefits to get them. And it's not the poor that are lying. It's people who make too much money who are. And so I support you, I applaud you, and wholeheartedly support you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Representative Ivey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Bacala, Mr. Pereira, in your fraud finding, or in the income findings, which proved to disqualify people for Medicaid, was this 100% of the expanded base, or did you find people actually being disqualified at claiming much lower income levels, trying to qualify for normal Medicaid?
I think Representative Ivey, I think that Mr. Prepara's 19,000 was purely expansion population. I think that the majority of the 30,000 identified by the Department of Health, the majority I think was expansion population. Both populations were 0 children in the household. That's how they pulled that particular group to survey.
Right. Do you have anything to add to that, Mr. Pereira?
What we've done, Representative Ivey, is we've looked at the population, and each time we go after kind of a portion of the population, because there's varying rules, and so one rule don't apply to all.
Right.
So
you're saying it's complicated, huh?
It's complicated. Yes, I'm saying it's complicated. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Is there currently any legal authority for LDH to connect with Department of Revenue to automate certain eligibility, at least initial findings? I know Secretary Robinson's here. She may be able to answer that if she comes.
My
in.
office made that recommendation some time ago, and my understanding is the Department of Health is going to implement the use of tax data in the initial applications for verification for eligibility,
Right.
and that should come in May or June of this year.
Okay, so they do have the legal authority to make that connection electronically?
Yes, sir.
Okay, because the reality is people's circumstances change. So one year they may technically
Right.
from prior year be ineligible, but their circumstances may change. And so initially it may throw a flag, but they may be able to prove that, hey, circumstances changed. In that same train of thought, of the people who were in this population, particularly those you mentioned, $100,000 of income or above, is it possible, or have you analyzed this to determine where initially someone was Medicaid eligible, but
Let me give you an example, if you don't mind. I hate to interrupt Representative Barrett.
You're good.
Representative Ivey. We had a case that a testimony before the Appropriations Committee. Lady's name was Amanda Schwab. Amanda Schwab made over $100,000 a year working as a professional in New Orleans. She was about to lose her job and insurance benefits, so she went to the healthcare exchange to just see what would be her options, how much she could be subsidized. And at some point in time, she said, "You know what? I'm just going to pay the COBRA payments from my insurance. I'm not going to take go through the healthcare exchange for a subsidy, even though she was going to be a zero earner." And soon after, a few months later, she got another six-figure job. She didn't know she had been enrolled in Medicaid, according to her testimony, until she received a letter from the Department of Health. The legislative auditor had identified her as an enrollee making more than $100,000. The Department of Health sent a letter to her, said, "You owe the state $5,089 because you were improperly enrolled." Her answer was, "I never even applied. Y'all signed me up." It turns out we had a program in place. It's called auto enrollment. And one of the ways you were auto enrolled, if you happen to just go play around on the ACA healthcare exchange, you could have been enrolled. So in her case, what is it? Fraud, waste, or abuse? I don't know. It's just somebody who got signed up by, I think, a bad policy, didn't know they were signed up. And she's one of those 100,000 earners. 100,000 earner prior to this last report. She was caught.
Right.
in
So it's
another-
not
in
all
another round.
technically fraud, just based on that one example. There could be situations where somebody was playing around.
I think a lot of it's not fraud. I think a lot of it's just
Process.
Somebody's
process,
checking
yes.
to see. Yeah.
yeah.
And Representative Ivey, the issue with those type of issues, those situations like Representative Bacala was talking about, is we are a managed care state, so we're paying out 100% of the premium, regardless of whether the individual uses the service.
Gotcha. Now, but and again, what would happen to an individual? Let's say they were unemployed, right? And they had to sign up by the deadline, and they signed up, and 6 months later they got a very lucrative job, and they're making, they make that $100,000 in that same calendar year. What would happen?
There's a requirement that you report a change of status. So even though there's a requirement that person who now got a great paying job goes back and reports, "I'm making more money now," not everybody does. So at some point in time, you're enrolled. 6 months ago, I got a good job now. You go back to unless somebody says, "Okay, take me off the rolls, I got a good job." Nobody's doing it automatically. It hasn't been checked real well. It's one of the reasons why we press for or getting a quarterly wage data check to try to start looking at some of this.
Right. So if that was integrated, if LDR's information and workforce, all that was integrated from
Yeah.
employers, individual, they could send a letter saying, "Look, it appears that your employment situation may have changed," and then make it convenient for
Right.
them to note report.
And that's important to note that the legislative auditor can't kick somebody off. All they can do is tell the Department of Health, this might be somebody you need to look at again.
Okay. And again, just being concerned for the lady who you
Amanda
said,
Schwab.
Ms. Schwab, who testified, do we have a remedy for the penalties that have been assessed in situations like that through this auto enrollment?
There's an appeals process. My understanding was that Department of Health was going to not pursue it, that she would go to the appeals process and it would be it'll
Yeah.
go away.
I think that could be a dark looming cloud over a lot of people who find themselves in that situation, and,
Right.
and maybe there should be some statutory remedy.
Yeah,
for
I
that.
think common sense prevailed in that one.
Yep. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative DeVilliers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few questions, I guess specifically with the bill that you have in its current posture. My first is what defines programs? It says it allows the legislative auditor to go in and audit state-operated or state-administered programs.
Well, I think if you read the whole section, it's very broad. So if a program in this case would be something, again, if you look a little earlier or later, where state dollars are being spent or tax dollars are being spent for something. So if tax dollars are being spent on something that has an income component or an asset component, then the legislative auditor, we would extend his authority to look at income tax records, not go audit somebody at their house, not go to their business. This extends the authority to him, adds a 42nd exception so that he can go look at an income tax record relative to the program, not anything else, just that one record. What he can look at today, just can't look at it for the purpose of auditing maybe a specific program.
It says individual income, corporate income, and franchise tax.
Yeah.
So he could go in upon request and audit anyone that receives those, correct?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the franchise, I don't know where it would actually play in, that they have a program that they're getting something from the state that's income or asset based. So, I mean, some of this is sort of, yes, but I don't know if there's even a program out there that falls there, quite frankly.
Mr. Prepera, am I saying that properly?
The sectional law that this is 24.513, and I think this might answer your question, Representative Ilya. 24.513 is the sectional law that instructs my office on who we audit, and it breaks it down into basically two major categories. There is what they call auditees and local auditees, and so this section is dealing with auditees, and it's making it specific to state government, and so I think so it would be all programs operated by state government if it meets these further qualifications in here.
So if a industry would receive quality jobs or enterprise zone, could that in fact trigger a request for an audit to that company?
Well, all those programs are currently operated by the state, and I have audit authority for each one of those programs. Currently, we do projects on those programs. So
what is the cost of an audit? I mean, I know it's probably
totally varies depending on it's basically kind of an hourly cost. So it depends on whether it's a 50-hour audit or a 4,000-hour audit. So yeah.
So if an individual like myself would request your department to do an audit on, let's just say a private or a publicly traded company, would this legislation allow you to be able to do that?
We don't typically do audits on a company like that. I guess I'm trying to figure out. We would do an audit of the program. So if you asked me to do an audit of the quality jobs program, then we could do an audit of the quality jobs program.
But this legislation would not, in fact, allow you to go in and audit a company or a private.
Well, I
business.
believe today probably the statutes today would give me the authority, if I'm auditing quality jobs program, then I can go to whoever's participating in that program today. I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
Yeah, it's just looking at it the way it currently sits and understanding the intent of the author, it seems like it's two totally different things in a sense. And when I look at the bill and the questions that come to mind is that the increased cost to the Louisiana Legislative Auditor's Office by making it so broad, I think it just... I don't know if we're doing exactly what the intent is of the author. When it comes to like privacy issues, I know I've asked the Department of Revenue to give us information on, just as an example, the collections of internet sales taxes. And we weren't able at that time to get that information because of privacy issues on the individuals who pay that. Could that in fact affect any of these private industries that are receiving something through maybe the Quality Jobs Program or Enterprise Zone, or could that in fact bring forth someone's private information and make it public?
Could it make it public? All right, so a couple of questions. One is, the current law gives me the authority to review all the tax returns, individual, corporate, whatever. I have a team of auditors that pretty much live year-round at the Department of Revenue, and they are able to look at under current law. Now, they're governed by various policies. For example, Publication 1075, I believe it is, with the IRS, because we have federal tax information also, which means that the team of individuals that work for me that do that work, they have to be fingerprinted and background investigations by FBI and that sort of thing, which also means we have to have certain, within the office, we have to have certain safeguards so that information isn't made public. So this would fall under that same guidelines. It would still fall under those same guidelines. So I guess the risk of something being made public would be, to me, it would be, we've never, we've never had that issue before because we have safeguards.
Okay, I mean that's where a lot of the concerns with this bill that I see. But I think whenever I listen to the opening statement and some questions that some of the members have brought forth, I think everyone would agree that we want to provide care to those individuals who need the care. And I would also agree that the department is doing a much better job seeking and finding those who are committing fraud, whether it's intentionally or not. I mean, that's just what you stated the numbers earlier. And I guess I would assume if we can remove those individuals that aren't or should not be on the government roll as far as the expansion goes, that could only help those individuals who actually need those services. It makes the resources more available. So with all that being said, I go back to your House Bill 480 that you had last year. And I think that was a good piece of legislation to try to just do that. I guess allow more resources for those who need the resources. And I would like to discuss with you amending this bill and putting it into the posture to narrow the scope and basically allow it to focus on Medicare, fraud. And that would only help those who need.
Well, certainly that if we amended the bill back to the form that it had last year in 480, that covers my primary concern, and certainly I'd have no objection to doing so, because again, that's the focus of the bill. Okay. And that's mostly what I've testified to today.
Thank you, Representative.
Representative Hewall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Simple question, Representative Bacala. There would be a cost to administer this. Do we have any idea what the savings would be once the process goes through and we find out those that are receiving this that are not eligible?
Every time a group has been studied in the Medicaid population, we've come up kind of, it seems like it's always around 8%. Maybe it's 7.5%, maybe it's 8.5%. We have about 1/3 of the state population. About 36% of the state population is now on Medicaid. It's 1.6 million people. So if we had an 8% error rate, now certainly some of those have already been removed, but if you look at past, present, future, you apply that 8%, we're talking about 128,000 people improperly enrolled. That's only speculation, but it's based on pretty good data, which it's $6,000 a person, which is about what it cost us. Federal and state dollars, you're talking about $750 million.
Thank you very much.
Assuming now it may be short of that, but I'm just telling you that's what data is pointing us to.
That is a great number.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Hewall. Representative Bacala and Mr. Prepared, if you mind giving up the table, I'm going to take up the opposition, and then we'll get back with you on closing or closing amendments. We'll do that. And members, keep in mind it's about 3:30. We go on the floor at 4 o'clock, so we got about 30 minutes left. I have cards in opposition who do not wish to speak. Dawn Starnes, NFIB, Ginger Adam Corley representing CLECO, Jody Montalero with Entergy. I have a card in opposition who does wish to speak, Dr. Daniel Mintz with the Louisiana Budget Project. Dr. Mintz.
Thank you very much. I rise in opposition to this bill, largely for reasons that have to do with the appropriateness of income tax data for assessing the accuracy of eligibility determinations for means-tested programs. The core of my testimony is that determining eligibility for programs like the SNAP program, which would also be covered under the broad umbrella of this bill, is a complicated process, and the information that is reported on an income tax form is complicated as well, but they're complicated in different ways. So if the state were to implement an audit that relies on the readily accessible data from income tax returns, there's a high likelihood that the error rate in those audits would potentially be significant. One cause of this error rate of this potential for error is that there's a mismatch between the periods in which income tax data is reported and the periods in which eligibility is determined. So to give you an example, if somebody is making slightly over the income level that would qualify them as eligible for a program like Medicaid or SNAP, and were to lose their job, but lose their job late enough in the calendar year that their overall yearly income would indicate that they should be ineligible for the program, they would in fact be program eligible, but would appear on this audit to be an example of error or potentially of fraud in the program. Essentially, this leads to a situation in which you'd be using data that would capture a fairly substantial, potentially a fairly substantial population who are playing by the rules of the program, but may be misidentified as ineligible by virtue of income that they'd earned prior to applying for benefits, or subsequently to from when they'd received benefits within a single calendar year. The Congressional Research Service did a report recently in September of 2018 looking at data sources that are used by states to verify eligibility, and they found that the Social Security Administration beneficiary earnings exchange record, which uses IRS tax data, is used by roughly half of all states who administer the SNAP program, only 10 of whom consider it useful. The broader point here is that tax data gives some very high-level information about beneficiaries of public benefits programs, but it's not the kind of match that we would want when looking for a fine-grained determination of whether these programs are benefiting only those people who are eligible for them or not. Similarly to Medicaid, the SNAP program is putting into effect a computerized system that utilizes robust data matching, and we would expect that program would have similar results to the Medicaid program, which is to say more accurate data on whether beneficiaries are eligible in the way that their application would suggest. This would be a return to a less robust source of data as opposed to the more detailed, nuanced, and accurate set of data that we have with the new computerized systems that both of these programs are putting into place.
Thank you, Dr. Mintz. I have a couple of questions for you. Representative Horton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Mintz, for being here today. I appreciate you. It was my understanding that we have policies in place to address the errors that you are concerned with. Doesn't our state give people a $20,000 a year difference, leeway to being wrong? Is there somebody to talk to us about the policies? Because, in fact, I think our state gives more of a, I don't know how to put it, a cushion, yes, thank you, Barry, than most states. Most 10, one I found was 15, but we do $20,000 a year. Even when we audit, we are already giving them $20,000 a year cushion to be really ineligible or eligible. I don't know, but so I don't understand your argument. I really don't get it, because it's black and white. You file your return, this is what you make, and if you are wrong or you lose your job, there are policies in place to be reassessed. And so I mean, when you have an error rate, a fraud rate like we do, I mean, what do you suggest?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between an error rate and a fraud rate.
Right. Error, fraud. I mean, you know, I prefer to just say somebody made an error, but I want people to get the benefit that deserve it and qualify.
So I should say my area of expertise is in food assistance policy, so I can't speak directly to the cushion that may exist in relation to Medicaid. My concern is specifically that because of there are various earnings disregards that are present in the SNAP program, which are not reflected in a tax return. So from the perspective of that program, which would be included in what this bill looks at, there's a substantial chance that people who are receiving benefits for which they are in fact eligible would be flagged as ineligible, leading to a misperception on the part of the legislature and the public at large of actual rates of error and fraud in the program. And I do think that has the potential to, that along with the accurate perception that their income tax records may be open to public audit, which, you know, I'm sure many of us would be reluctant to have our own income tax records open for public consideration, may dissuade eligible individuals from taking advantage of programs for which they're eligible.
Well, I certainly wouldn't look at anything but the report. I don't know that we're privy to what a name and a amount that they made and how the error was. All we see is the results of a report, and our auditor provides that to the Department of Health, and then they can go back and take that information and compare it to the application, and then proceed accordingly to verify or not is your return correct? Is it still correct? I mean, all his report does is verify that someone qualifies or doesn't, and it's up to the department to take it and do with it what they choose.
Well, I suppose my contention is that the department has put into place a reporting system that's more robust than what income tax returns would allow. And so returning simply to income tax returns as a means of determining eligibility would be taking a step backward from the computer systems that are put into place that use more up-to-date and more accurate reporting, in my understanding of individual income.
Well, I think it works really well for the 36 states that have adopted it because they thought it was a common sense measure. But what I love is your heart. You want to make sure our children are fed, and I appreciate that because I do as well. And thank you for taking the time to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Horton. Representative Ivey, Representative Ivey, and if you don't mind, try to keep it brief. So we're going to have, as my understanding, no, you're doing fine. We have two amendments, one by Representative James and one by Representative DeVilliers that we have to get to. So Representative Ivey.
I'm always asked to be brief when it comes to me. I'm kidding, Mr. Chairman. I'm kidding. Okay, Dr. Mintz, first of all, concerning the legislative auditor's responsibility authority as it pertains to this bill, whatever information and assessment the legislative auditor makes, is he allowed to kick anyone off of the roll or determine an actual whether something was fraud or whether someone is disqualified under this?
To my knowledge, no.
Right.
I believe not.
So the purpose of the legislative auditor is to do, it sounds like in this bill, to be able to perform a lot of the heavy lifting and at least identify, you know, as statistically as best you can, most likely cases where there may be some fraud or some, as apparently they found out, there's people being auto-enrolled in the program, which is a problem. And so, but this sounds like a lot of heavy lifting that can be turned over to LDH, to where LDH could then go in and do the more detailed assessment necessary. As you stated, there are a lot of different parameters, and it gets a little weedy, I'm sure, for eligibility.
I believe that LDH already, as a matter of course, is using computerized data sources to check against reported eligibility. And this goes to the Representative James's point earlier, that the computer system that has gone online does check against a variety of data sources to determine whether these eligibility determinations appear to be correct. I don't believe that that a shift to income tax data as the primary means for assessing whether those determinations are correct is likely to be more accurate than the systems that.
Well, again, we're not trying to get the most. I mean, there's a balance, right? Your base, you need to pare it down to something that's kind of manageable where you can do further assessment. I'm just trying to understand how income data wouldn't be relevant in determining eligibility for a program like this. Again, I fully understand someone could have made $80,000 in that calendar year, got unemployed, and timing-wise applied, and there's legitimate situations out there like that. I'm not trying to infer that all of this is fraud, but that wouldn't shouldn't throw a flag to where someone could do a little more investigation into that specific case?
Well, I don't dispute the relevance of that data. I would just call into question the accuracy of that data. And I do think the heart of my concern is that there are costs associated with more aggressively pursuing accusations of fraud or error based on less reliable data. And the major cost that I would see in this is the possibility of dissuading people who are entitled to a benefit from claiming that benefit based on a concern, whether it's founded or not, that they're more likely to be the target of investigation by the department. I should say not clearly not by the legislative auditor, but if the auditor is in the position where they are presenting a list of names that should be considered for further scrutiny.
Sure. Well, if you take your system, whatever, again, I'd be interested to know, how y'all analyze that. But if you take y'all's system and you incorporate and add to the income portion that the legislative auditor would like to do, if the only red flag is with the legislative auditor, well, then maybe that doesn't rise to the top of the list. But if you incorporate that income data with what you're doing over here, maybe that's just another red flag or two that would put that at the top of the list as far as for further investigation. I'd also believe it's pretty safe to say that the dollars saved in actually finding the fraud that's in there, it far outweigh the savings of finding the fraud and dealing with it, should far outweigh the cost for analyzing and doing a little more homework when using the. I
think it's an important question. I can't speak to the dollar figures.
Okay. Let's see. What in your you have apparently a new system coming online or just came online. What is the best way to disincentivize actual fraud? Because I think that's what we're all most concerned about. Not people who are truly eligible. That's what it's there for. But what about the actual fraud cases?
Again, I can speak more authoritatively to the food assistance program to SNAP, but the SNAP tends to have very, very low fraud and error rates. Most fraud occurs at the retailer level as opposed to the recipient level, and there are very strong deterrents in the program already to prevent fraud at the level of the recipient, namely a ban from program participation with the finding of fraud, and regular checks that will be in place when the new integrated eligibility system comes online against a variety of wage and employment databases that are reported at the state level.
Okay, and then right now, what's the current process for reporting changes of your income for eligibility?
It varies depending on the recipient circumstance, and this is true nationally. Some categories of individuals, elderly retired individuals who might not be expected to have regular changes in income report on a less regular schedule, but all recipients are required to report a change in income status that would change their eligibility status in the program.
Mechanically, how do they report? Is it via paper? Is it an online portal?
It can be either of the above. There's an online portal called La Cafe that can be used to do that reporting. There are also paper forms that individuals who can use.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Representative Villia.
Yeah, I have an amendment, Mr. Acting Chair.
Okay. Can we have it ready? It's a conceptual amendment.
Thank you.
You want to describe it, Representative Villia?
Yeah, so basically what I'm trying to do is put his bill.
And Doctor, thank you. Representative Bacala.
What I'm trying to do is put his bill in the same posture that his bill was last year, allowing for the legislative auditor to access individual level state income tax return data for the limited purpose of ensuring accuracy of Medicaid eligibility determinations is the concept.
Okay. I was just informed Representative James' amendment was actually placed first. Representative Villiers' light was up first. So, Representative James, we're going to take yours first since you want to. Well, Representative James is going to defer to Representative Villiers, so we're going to take his conceptual amendment first. And we have a question by Representative Ivey on that amendment.
Yes. So, as I read the bill in its current posture, this allows for the inclusion of individual income returns, corporate income returns, and franchise tax return data for the auditor to assess any program. You're wanting to limit it to only the Medicaid program? Is that what this amendment does? Okay. Could you state the general purpose of pairing this type of accountability and a billet authority?
You got me up?
Well, I'm trying to turn him. Hold on. Okay. There we go. Representative Villiers.
So I appreciate your question, but in his opening statement and throughout the entire debate, I mean, we spoke on Medicaid eligibility. And so his bill, as it sits right now, is extremely broad. And I have reservations with that, so I'm offering a conceptual amendment on trying to narrow it to just the eligibility side on the Medicaid. So.
And Representative Ivey, Ms. Pryor is going to make an explanation and might answer your question. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman. All right, just to further discuss the conceptual amendment that Representative DeVilliers is going to offer, we are going to go into Section 1508 of the Code, which deals with the authority of the Secretary of the Department of Revenue to disclose information, and we're going to limit it. We're going to limit the information that she can share with the auditor, and it's going to be information that the auditor can utilize, and it's going to be data exclusively for ensuring accuracy of Medicaid eligibility determinations, detecting and preventing fraud in the Medicaid program, and fulfilling the requirements of the Medicaid Assistance Program's integrity law. So it will be restricted to those particular programs.
Thank you. Representative Ivey.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair. So again, I'd like to point to consistency and principle. So regardless of the tax program or the program that state tax dollars are being spent on, whether it be an incentive program, whether it be Medicaid, any of the DCFS services that taxpayers are funding, I can't see why we want to limit the legislative auditor, who, in my personal opinion, has one of the most important functions of all government. They are the watchdog for the taxpayers. And so I can't see how paring this down could be beneficial to the taxpayer. And honestly, I'm surprised that the legislative auditor didn't already have this broad authority, to be honest with you. And so also I believe that the bill would have a better chance of passing by maintaining its broad authority versus paring it down. I do believe that we could get more bipartisan buy-in on a more broad context. Just my 2 cents there. So I'd have to oppose this amendment.
Representative Morris for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, it's for Allison. Will this amendment limit the scope of the legislative auditor to use the information in other programs? In other words, will this amendment, if it passes into law, will it limit their scope of their existing abilities?
Mr. Morris, I think the answer to the question is yes, because under the grant of authority that we will give to the legislative auditor, it's going to be limited to ensuring accuracy of the Medicaid eligibility determinations, detecting and preventing fraud in the Medicaid program, and other applicable requirements of the Medical Assistance Program's integrity law. So it is specific for the authority of the auditor as well as the authority of the Secretary to disclose the information.
So this amendment would restrict the legislative auditor going forward, not just with respect to the Medicaid program, but with other programs Am I understanding that correct? You said yes, it would.
The language would specifically, it says the legislative auditor may access individual level state income tax return data for the limited purposes of what I just went down the list of.
So it would limit it for all the other functions for which they're actually using income tax data.
I think, Representative Morris, I think right now they're very limited. They can use income tax data to audit the Department of Revenue, but they can't use income tax data elsewhere. So we're opening it up.
I understand the purpose of the amendment is, as I understand it, and Representative DeVilliers can correct me, but the purpose of the amendment is to reduce the scope of this bill. But my concern is that his amendment will not only reduce the scope of this bill, but will reduce the ability of the legislative auditor to access the data that he currently can access.
It doesn't. We're not making him.
I just asked Allison that question, and she said yes.
No, I think the
If you're
Could
messing
we
with
have the auditor come up?
definitions.
Do you have any clarification?
the amendment adds a 40-second exemption, but doesn't limit any prior exemption.
It's
So-
not going to limit, it's not going to change present law. It is adding a new authority to the legislative auditor to access this information. Mr. Auditor, if you want to correct me.
Adds an exemption, but doesn't reduce any other exemption.
I believe Representative Bacala is correct on that. I don't see how it limits our current authority, but if it does, I'd be worried about it.
Right. I just want to make sure it doesn't and bring that information forward if you're going into any sort of definitional section or anything like that.
No, sir.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Acting.
Thank you, Representative Morris. Representative Bowie for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair. I also have a concern about the amendment because it's contrary to what Representative Bacala said the intent of this bill was. I heard Representative Bacala say that any entity or program that receives a public dollar should be subjected to this kind of audit. Representative DeVilliers' amendment will actually limit that to only one program. So I'm confused as to Representative Bacala's intent and now what the amendment does, which narrows it to only one program.
I think there's one more component, Representative Bowie. It's $1 spent on a program that is income or asset based. So it's something that's based on how the program recipients have to be narrowly that. So that's the other component of the bill. Three parts. Honestly, it looks like I have the primary purpose of the bill is the Medicaid. I'd like to keep that. That's my primary purpose. I think we have ample evidence that dollars are being spent there. I don't want to title it, but dollars are being spent there that could be utilized better within the program or somewhere else. And quite frankly, I don't want to fight the battle on too many fronts. So I'm okay with the amendment. I would be okay if we took this up as a separate bill in a different session. Or perhaps this session, if somebody wanted to file a bill, maybe it would fit the bill as a fiscal bill. But I kind of get what we're trying to do here. What Representative DeVilliers is trying to do is let's go after the thing that we think we need to do and not again fight the battle on too many fronts.
Thank you, Representative Bowie. Representative Davis for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair. I need some clarification, and Representative Bacala, you may not know, but maybe Kimberly can help us, or Mandy if she's here. Because I hear we're talking about some of these programs through LED, some of these maybe the angel investor programs or R&D or quality jobs has come up. Doesn't LED and LDR already do some type of compliance and audit before state dollars are given out with the credits or the rebates, or isn't that already verified before we do that?
My understanding is that, yeah, they're already doing it. My understanding also is the legislative auditor, even without this bill, is doing some audits of those anyway.
Correct.
But
He can already do that.
yeah, they're already being audited. This adds one more little piece to the puzzle, but quite frankly, I don't know that it even anybody would even notice a law change there if we did. Right now, the auditor can go into a lot of those programs and look directly at the books. So we're not granting him that authority here. He can already look at the programs. We're not granting him that authority here. All we're doing is go back, and if it's income-based or asset-based, you get to look at those programs in a very confined environment and turn something over to his responsibility, and that program would be to turn the findings over to the agency tasked with overseeing the program. That's it. And he's kicking nobody off. He might file a report that says what his findings are. But anyway, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Representative Davis. I see no additional questions, so we'll go ahead. And there's been a motion by Representative DeVilliers to adopt an amendment. Do I hear any objections? There's an objection by Representative James. Madam Secretary will go ahead and read the roll.
Representative Morris?
Okay. Well, have Ms. Pryor explain the vote.
Okay, thank you. The amendment is the conceptual amendment to narrow the scope of the bill to the Medicaid program and the fraud associated with the program. And so a vote of yes is in favor of the amendment, and a vote of no is to not be in favor of the amendment.
Thank you, Ms. Pryor. Okay, Madam Secretary, we will read the roll.
Representative Jim Morris? Representative Bowie? No. Representative Boyack? Yes. Representative Davis? Yes. Representative DeVilliers? Yes. Representative Duplessis? No. Representative Dwight?
Yes.
Yes. Representative Harris? No. Representative Horton? Yes. Yes. Representative Huval?
Yes.
Yes. Representative Ivey?
No.
No. Representative James? No. Representative Johnson?
No.
No. Representative Lacombe? No. Representative Morris?
No.
No. Representative Schexnayder?
Yes.
Yes. Representative Stefanski?
No.
No. Representative Stokes? No. Fails by 7 yeas and 10 nays.
The motion is not adopted. Next, we have Representative James' amendment. Yes, and I'll have Ms. Pryor read that amendment.
Okay, the amendment is conceptual once again, and it's going to be on page 2 of the bill after between lines 21 and 22. We're going to add a new paragraph of authority under the Secretary of the Department of Revenue's authority to disclose about the confidentiality of tax records, and the language that we're going to add is a new paragraph 44, and it's going to say the Secretary from disclosing details on each type of state tax expenditure in excess of $50,000 claimed by a taxpayer, including the name of the taxpayer and the amount of the tax expenditure. The information shall be disclosed by the Secretary and published each year in the annual tax exemption budget. For purposes of this paragraph, the term tax expenditure shall include state tax exemptions, deductions, credits, or rebates. And part of this amendment will also be to make the technical corrections to the title, etc., that may be necessary to make the bill consistent.
Representative James, do you want any explanation? Or?
I want to be able to look at all of the information. If we're going to be the watchdog for the taxpayer, let's be a watchdog over every taxpayer. Representative Bacala talked about when he answered Representative Davis's question about this being a little piece. It's a little piece when it's referred to one type of taxpayer, but it's the only piece for certain taxpayers. So I want to be able to get that information in this nice tax exempt budget that we received today regarding all of our tax credit programs. If we're going to open up the confidentiality records of taxpayers, let's open them all up.
For a question, Representative Ivey.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Acting Chair. For my friend in the back row, I question the germaneness to this bill by including and publishing taxpayers' personal names and stuff for that in a bill specifically designed for legislative auditors' access. I would also want to refer your amendment to House and Governmental for dual refer on the amendment. This is tongue in cheek because it's got to go on the bill, obviously. But I certainly understand the need to have access to the data for purposes of assessing these other programs. I just don't. I have an issue with the naming the taxpayers when, again, we can independently audit these taxpayers confidentially without publishing the data and still maintain the accountability that we do need. I don't see how publishing the names is going to actually help. So I'd ask you withdraw your amendment, and maybe we can work on some other solution to take care of what you're trying to get to.
You grow a beard, now you think we friends, huh, man?
Thank you, Representative Ivey.
I'm gonna go maintain my amendment.
Okay, I see no additional questions. So at this time, Representative James has made a motion to adopt an amendment. Do I hear an objection? Yeah, an objection by Representative Horton. You want to explain it one more time for clarity, Ms. Pryor?
Okay, so the amendment would, if a vote in favor is in favor of the amendment that I just read out, the conceptual amendment for Representative James, that would be yeas, and nays would be opposed to the amendment.
Okay. Ms. Bryant, we will have you call the roll.
Representative Jim Morris? Representative Bowie? Yes. Representative Boyack? No. Representative Davis? No. Representative DeVilliers? No. No. Representative Duplessis? Yes. Representative Dwight? No. Representative Harris? Yes. Representative Horton? No. No. Representative Huval? No. No. Representative Ivey? No. Representative James? Yes. Representative Johnson? Yes. Yes. Representative Lacombe? No. Representative Morris? No. No. Representative Schexnayder? No. No. Representative Stefanski?
No.
No. Representative Stokes? No. No.
Mr. Kent?
The vote is fell by 5 yeas and 12 nays.
Okay. Okay, so we are back on the bill, and we have a question by Representative Horton on the bill. Yes.
Vote the motion. Voluntary defer the bill.
There's been a motion to voluntarily defer. Do I hear an objection? I hear an objection by Representative Ivey.
Yeah, substitute motion to move favorably on the bill.
And we've had a substitute motion to report favorably. So we will vote on the substitute motion to report favorably. Everyone understand what we're voting on?
Tony wanted to defer.
Let's go ahead and let Representative Bacala close, and then I have some cards to read in. Hold on. Representative Dwight with a question.
Is there opposition to the bill?
There was a motion to report unfavorably and a substitute motion to report favorably.
Yeah, but are we on closing for Representative Bacala now?
I do not have anyone who wants to. No, I do. I'm sorry. We do have a couple cards that wish to testify. So let's go. Jody Montalero with Energy. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair and representatives. We appreciate your time. We visited briefly, some of the utilities visited briefly ahead of this before this meeting. We wanted to clarify, Representative James, before any of the amendments or anything. We visited with Representative Bacala about some of our concerns, and again, it went from generally business about the broadness of this. I think some of you who are on this committee last year in the 2018 regular session will probably remember a bill wherein the Legislative Auditor's Office came before you with a report that said that the Louisiana Tax Commission was in fact not conducting the way that it is supposed to be doing business in the correct manner. And the Legislative Auditor's Office came in front of you and said, came and put their information in front and said, we have 3 MBA individual graduates who are questioning the way in which properly trained people at the tax commission are evaluating assets throughout the state of things such as utilities, pipelines, and et cetera. Now, I think one of the things that I pointed out last year when I was here opposing the bill that was basically adopting the legislative auditor's report was that they did not at that time have the expertise to do valuations such that the tax commission did. One of my arguments was I just finished an MBA program at LSU, and I could certainly not valuate tax properties throughout the state of Louisiana. And so I think that this bill goes a little bit further. It's not just talking about programs and how they're administered and giving them the authority to look into this, but it's also allowing them to question the manner in which the groups that have the expertise on these particular programs, or whether it be the way that taxes are done, et cetera, it allows them to come in and question that. And I'm no disrespect to the legislative auditor at all, but I think at the end of the day, you are going to have a pretty good amount of opposition, I would imagine, from some of the business community in general, because at the end of the day, we defer a lot to some of the expertise of some of the agencies who are properly installed with some of the authority and some of the expertise here. And so I do agree with Representative Villiers that it would not only be somewhat of a waste of resources, but it also requires companies then to come in and re-justify. Certainly something we're happy to visit and explain about with the agencies that are administering the program or speaking directly to us. But it also involves information that, like for instance in our case, that the proprietary data of our customers and things that we already do not give out. So I just respectfully oppose the bill in its current posture. And that's it. Haven't entertained any questions, and thank you.
I see no questions. Representative Ivey.
Again, being familiar with the situation that was presented last year, whenever it was, and I believe, you prevailed in, again, legislative auditor does make assessments. There's certain guidelines they follow, which is permitted. I believe there's a balance to be found in this, where we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, where we can find a balance where the legislative auditor and, concerning these types of nuanced interpretations, or not interpretations, but assessments and things like that, where certain amount of deference can be placed on the experts performing those, and it more be a check and balance, make sure the numbers do match, work up, some of the criteria that's clearly spelled out is being adhered to. So would you be willing to work on an amendment, if we defer this
have indicated
temporarily?
to Representative Bacala that we certainly would be willing to work on an amendment. Our preference would be to work on an amendment sometime while it's in the committee process. I know that he didn't want to do too much on the fly today, and I appreciate that he entertained some of the emotions and the things that went on here in committee. I think at the end of the day, we would like to get things straightened out before it leaves the committee, and we're certainly fine with hopefully waiting and working with him for a while. We don't want something to just start running through the process under the blanket of policy. It's something that we want to make sure that is actually good policy for all the individuals who may be affected when we're having a specific conversation about a specific intent on a bill, and then there's a full conversation about some of the unintended consequences of what may then happen, and then letting the bill go on and pass through the chambers is just one of the things that concerns us a little bit in that regard. So certainly we're open to any kind of amendments as you're suggesting, and certainly would love to do that before it leaves this particular committee if possible.
All right. And I think we need to be consistent in our policy. I understand the political dynamics at play in this particular issue, dealing with Medicaid and some of the people's passionate perspectives, and the same thing on business, members with passionate perspectives. We need to create uniform policy. So if we're relying on the expertise in certain fields, it needs to be broadly applied to other programs that, that were, under the legislative auditor's purview. So I will defer to the will of the author of the bill, and I'll withdraw my motion to report. If his preference is to keep in committee, let us work on it a little bit longer and try to work out some of the details. Thank you.
Also present but not wishing to speak in opposition is Robert Schramm with Louisiana Chemical Association, Dawn Starnes with NFIB, Ginger Adam Corley with CLECO, and Judge Spock. Representative Bacala, on your close.
Thank you. I think I think this is going to be difficult today. It's like we can get yeses and nos. Everybody agrees, but we can't find the final version that we can pass off this committee. I think that's pretty evident. So I think the best course of action, Mr. Acting Chair, is to, I have no opposition to the motion to voluntarily defer. Maybe we can sit down, talk about this, get some better amendments out there, or come back to some of the current amendments. Briefly come in here again and let you guys vote on something a little different.
And that's fine. I'll go ahead and make the motion to voluntarily deferred. Do we have any objection? With no objection, it is deferred.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee members.